Welcome. This is Local Energy Advocates of Western Mass. And today we are hearing from Paul Fenn. And I'm going to turn it over to Darcy. Are you doing the introduction?
Adele is going to do the
Adele.
I'm going to introduce Paul, and Paul is going to take it away.
Please mute if you're not, or maybe Darcy, you can help to mute people if they're not muted.
Good. Okay, so I'm going to introduce Paul. Paul Fenn is the founder and president of Local Power and has over 25 years of success developing new energy programs that allow communities to become energy independent and successful. This has saved billions of dollars and led to many gigawatts of new renewable energy. And we are very lucky that Paul now lives locally. He is well recognized for multiple innovations in policy as it relates to energy and law and finance, et cetera, et cetera. And he co-authored the original law, municipal aggregation law in Massachusetts 25 years ago, and drafted a second generation CCA 2.0 law in California in 2000. And since 2001, Fenn's group has focused on programs to re-engineer the grid and created strategies to lower the cost of renewable energy. Fenn wrote the third generation CCA 3.0 model in 2020 and was an early consultant to Amherst, Pelham, and Northampton's joint aggregation plans. He will present tonight about a bill he has written with Senator Paul Mark and has now actually been given a bill number, which is S.2301. The bill is to increase the ability of CCAs to expand their ability to increase renewables and make energy more efficient, make their buildings more efficient. The first part would make changes to the existing laws so that municipalities could build on-site renewables to be used on-site without the need for new grid resources. This would avoid the utilities' power to delay permitting for such energy facilities. The second part of the bill would set a deadline for approval of DPU of CCA plans to use the energy efficiency funds currently controlled by the utilities under the Mass Save program. This would give the communities the ability to use ratepayer funds to make their buildings more energy efficient. So now I'm going to turn it over to Paul. Paul, you're muted. Can you unmute Paul, Darcy?
Good. I got it. Sorry about that.
Okay.
Hi, Tim. Now I'm just sharing. You see two screens now?
Yes, we see two slides.
Okay, great. So I'm going to do this two-slide approach here. I hope it isn't too distracting. Thank you for having me. I'm glad to be here. You heard some background. Been working on municipal aggregation for pretty much my whole adult life. But you've heard the background on 2.0 and 3.0. I'm going to get into some of the slides, but the main starting point is that CCA was really always meant as a climate solution from the beginning, from 1994 when I worked in the state senate and drafted the law here. That was the idea, to create this platform for communities to decarbonize energy, to address climate change, to have the leverage to do so. Um, and so the last 30 years have really been, it's not 30 years, have been focused on how to make that happen. And things really got in the way. Uh, uh, and the form, the kind of lessons learned from my point of view, that CCAs tended to want to minimize their workload and keep things simple. And they focused on discounts instead of on changing energy. And their suppliers also wanted to minimize their workload and focused on renewable energy certificates rather than building renewable energy. And so both the suppliers and the municipalities tended to neglect to engage energy users and really miss the opportunity for real change. At the same time that utilities and state regulators really, in my view, colluded to discourage and block those communities that did embrace real change. So you had both a kind of inertia on one side and obstruction on the other. So we've been working with municipalities for since then, and also working with states to try to remove the barriers and realize the potential that CCA has with our most dramatic success occurring in California. So I'm just going to go through some of the issues that contextualize the bill, Senator Mark's bill, failures of climate policy. First is really just climate policy collapse, the overdependence of the energy industry on these three instruments to address climate change: carbon trading, renewable energy certificates, and net metering. Um, the most obvious today, fairly widely recognized, is the failure of carbon markets and the problem of fraud within carbon markets. The degree of manipulation in carbon markets profoundly undermining uh, all of the activities of within the private sector to use them. They still are used, and there are all these unending efforts to reform those markets. They don't succeed, and ultimately they simply are a fraudulent way of dealing with climate change. Less well known is the fraud within renewable energy certificate use, the illusion of a person selling power back onto the grid, when in fact, I'm sorry, selling, yeah, buying certificates, the illusion that they're buying green power when in fact they're buying brown power with renewable energy certificates. Obviously, there are varying degrees of quality in these certificates uh, between, in-state 10-year-old or less existing renewables, which are the gold standard, and out of state, any age renewables, which are the lower standard. But both forms, even the high quality and the low quality, fail to capture many of the benefits of renewable energy and cause great damage in the marketplace and in the minds of people who want to make meaningful choices and don't know what is real anymore because of the fictions that are spread throughout the market and really confuse and muddle uh, public policy discussion around renewable energy. So this is a map of the community choice aggregations in Massachusetts and the level of class one renewable energy content. Those are the so-called gold standard renewable certificates versus the those that really don't use them at all. Um, and Western Massachusetts obviously has quite a few aggregations, and which continue to use renewables. In my own town, Williamsburg, this is the web page for our CCA broker, showing 41% national wind recs, a closer look at what those certificates mean, and it shows you that they're not concealing the actual meaning, which is that it is a market-based instrument that you're purchasing, uh, and not renewable power. Um, this is profoundly confusing to normal people, when almost everyone that I ever talk to about this fact is utterly baffled by the subject. I mean, energy activists can be more likely to understand these distinctions, but normal people just don't. And it is the harm that's done through this sort of fictional approach to renewable energy is immense, particularly as it relates to climate action and the meaningfulness of renewable energy as a climate benefit. Net metering has similar problems. Exporting solar energy to the grid requires upgrades to the grid, and someone must pay for those upgrades. And so there is a similar kind of fiction in net metering. You could say less so, but it's become much more manifest in places like California, where the fact that when you are paid for your renewable energy, you're not being paid for a sale of power to the grid. You're being paid a subsidy, which is collected from other customers, and what that results in ultimately is bad politics that voters turn against it, and as voters have turned against it. And so I just got this email this morning. Governor Newsom in California now moving not only to discontinue net metering in California, but to violate the contracts of those under net metering, which he's now proposing to do with the California Public Utilities Commission. So those who already have systems and are depending upon net metering payments to repay them and to realize the savings of their investments may now lose those payments. Their contracts may be violated. So that's the first class of failures just within the policy framework that has existed for the past 30 years. The second is more active obstruction by the utility, and this relates more to the bill that we're talking about today. Collusion really between the utilities and state regulators, not just in Massachusetts, but I would say in some ways particularly so in Massachusetts, also in California. Utilities have resisted CCAs administering energy efficiency funds that they otherwise control. The original aggregation law in 1997 said that municipal aggregations may petition to administer the funds paid by their ratepayers. In fact, the first aggregation, Cape Light Compact, does so. Has administered those funds for over 20 years very successfully. Every subsequent municipality that has petitioned the DPU to administer those funds has been stonewalled. In other words, just not responded to for years at a time. And this was a failure to comply with the law. At the same time that the DPU has allowed utilities to force cookie cutter rules on the way that solar systems and on-site renewable energy systems connect to the grid that profoundly discourage and penalize local power system development. It's something which is kind of less obvious, uh, maybe less understandable, but I'll get into it. Adele mentioned the basic description of it, but often people are a little mystified why it matters. This concerns the tariff of the utilities and how systems are connected and what costs are associated with those interconnections and what delays are associated with those connections. So, just going back to the high level, climate is not making much progress across the world, the United States or across the world. No real progress. Voter backlash against what little progress has been made, and the politicization of climate action as an elitist activity. Um, you have community choice aggregation now has been quite successful across the country. There around 2,000 cities and a dozen states that are CCAs. 1 in 10 Americans are served by them. They lead in savings. They lead in green power. And they were the largest issuers of green bonds last year in the United States, larger than China and Canada. The aggregation programs in California, total investment $35 billion, green bond investment $15 billion so far in California. So just comparing Massachusetts to California kind of gives a bit of the story behind the legislation, the need to stimulate a more development based approach in Massachusetts, which just hasn't really taken here. In Massachusetts, you have 100, maybe it's, I think it's the number's risen a bit. It's 168 municipalities at last count, 76 of which purchase additional renewable energy certificates to legally green their mix. If you compare that to 250 municipalities in California, all of which directly built new in-state renewables rather than purchasing certificates. So if you compare them in terms of their renewable development, the Massachusetts CCAs have bought about 700 megawatts worth of renewables from existing facilities. They've maybe built about 1 megawatt of renewables at last count. Compare that to California, where the CCA programs have built 20,000 megawatts of new in-state renewables just in the past 6 or 7 years, $35 billion of investment, $15 billion in green bonds as of last year. The Cape Light Compact did make the top 20 list for National Renewable Energy Laboratory, utilities selling renewables above state minimums. 9 of the top 10 in the United States are California CCA 2.0 programs. They have 10 times the number of customers of the next 10 on the NREL list. So they pretty much blew up the NREL list in terms of that metric. In terms of looking at the model benefits, 1.0 is focused on rate discounts, largely in Massachusetts. You're looking at rate discounts. California did not focus at all on rate discounts. It was all focused on rate parity. And the 3.0 program is focused on ownership. So it's getting out of rates and it's getting into ownership benefits as a different criterion for why it is to participate. Under 1.0, the municipality's role is really focused just on complying with state requirements, qualifying for grants. It has a fairly de minimis role. Under 2.0, the municipalities become regional sustainable economic development entities. They look at regional job creation. They're generally building large plants versus under 3.0 is focused on local behind the meter plants. Municipalities are involved in distributed energy resource development and resilience planning, local economic development, carbon reduction, decarbonizing buildings, and local job creation. On the clean energy front, 1.0 programs are really very focused on renewable energy certificates or piloting small solar systems and these sorts of things. The 2.0 really brought scale to local renewable energy development and the way I described to you, but does not really perform that well on the distributed energy resource front, going behind the meter. And that's really where we're going with the 3.0 model, focused on getting behind the meter into homes and buildings and focusing on customer user engagement and ownership of those systems. So just in terms of take back, we feel like the way to the main message now, is we need to get real. That these policies that I've presented are not real. They're unreal, and they have caused a lot of damage because they're not real. They involve spending money without having palpable benefits, economic benefits, consumer benefits, community benefits. It's just an expenditure, a sacrifice, and so we are disengaging from renewable energy certificates as a paradigm. We're also disengaging from net metering as a dependency structure. We're recognizing that grid interconnect of renewables is the main bottleneck on the system for decarbonization. That in order to, every state that has renewable energy supply goals, it needs to have 3 to 4 times the grid to support centralized renewable supply. It's just not realistic. It's not going to happen. We're not going to build 3 or 4 times the grid we have. It raises prices for all consumers when you do that. It has nonlinear impacts on pricing in a profoundly disruptive way that harms the business case for making the transition. So it's not a realistic pathway. And net metering has reached its limits, and a bypass strategy is needed to make DERs, distributed energy resources, into the primary category of resource in a new business model for energy. So just returning to the United Nations, because we really view them as the kind of the threshold definition of what needs to happen. Energy transitions by 2030. The UN calls for replicable energy transitions fully underway by 2030, and that's power, heating, vehicles, and waste. Uh, those are the addressable carbon sources under the UN definition. Those are carbon sources that can be regulated by government, as opposed to those that cannot be. So our CCA program includes all four of those carbon sources. It isn't merely aggregating electricity, it's aggregating heating, vehicles, and waste services. So the CCA 3.0 is really a platform for community-wide energy transitions, broadly speaking. And if you compare the impact of the three models, 1.0 in Massachusetts, 1 megawatt built about, to the 20,000 megawatts built in California in the last 5 years, and compare 2.0 to 3.0, we don't have the results in yet because we're just launching it right now in New York State, but we are, in our estimate, 3.0 is orders of magnitude more powerful than California was in terms of how much change can be achieved and how quickly it can be achieved if the political will is there to do so. And so I'm going to speed up a little bit. The 1.0 model focused on certificates, to the 2.0 focused on buying directly from generators and building facilities and using green bonds to finance them, and the 3.0 model, which is focused on helping customers own their own energy and beyond the site, behind the meters, to reduce their dependency on the grid and the pipeline. It's not these sort of abstract renewable energy products, but physically demand reducing products instead, is the basic description here. So reducing less carbon, use less supply. It's not about greening supply. It's about reducing the use of supply across all four of these categories: to decarbonize power, to decarbonize heating, vehicles, and waste. And how do you do that? You do that by building interoperable systems that connect all four as a single resource. In other words, that vehicles become batteries, that heating systems become batteries, even waste becomes a battery for an interoperable building-based network. Those could be known as microgrids, or as nanogrids, or as thermal loops, or as thermal mini districts. There are different ways to connect and design these systems, but they are focused on buildings and adjacent buildings, and connecting neighbors and enabling neighbors to use these systems, to de-silo these devices, to make them into interoperable systems that don't require exporting to pay for them, and that, because they don't depend upon export, can be built community-wide without causing distribution upgrade costs and causing this problem that net metering costs. So to go to the bill, the bill is really dealing with it's not trying to solve the problem of the lack of political will in municipalities to do real things. That has to be done locally, and it has to be done organically from the ground up. But this bill is trying to deal with the state's half of the problem, which is the utility and the Department of Public Utilities obstruction. And so the bill, sponsored by Senator Paul Mark, is now 2301, would make building community-wide DERs possible without unnecessary delays and excessive costs, and it would give CCAs timely access to energy efficiency funds paid by their ratepayers. So in the first of it, it's a very simple bill. It's a very short bill. Uh, the idea is to remove a really silly barrier to a rapid build out of on-site renewables, which comes from a utility practice under their interconnect tariffs that subject interconnects for solar systems or solar plus battery systems or any systems, DER systems, to the same uh, procedures, whether they're exporting their power or not exporting their power. So, in other words, if you want to install a non-exporting system, which is what 3.0 would do, they will still connect you as if you were going to export. And so there simply isn't a procedure, it's an omission that in effect gives a signal to developers and to consumers who want to build systems that there's no point in building a non-exporting system because you have to pay for it anyway. It's a so it's something that we can get into a discussion about it, but it is a significant barrier, although it sounds kind of superficial in a way. It's not. The other is more obvious, which is that the aggregation law required that CCAs applying to administer energy efficiency funds of their ratepayers may do so. This would simply set a timeline for the Department of Public Utilities to answer such petitions. So, in terms of local support for the legislation, first thing is to contact your state representative and senator, asking them to sign on to the bill. Second would be to write a letter of support for the bill for when it goes to committee. It's in the DTE committee and or the UTE committee. And then the third would be to call on your municipality to support the bill by resolution. That's the end of these are my contacts, and I will leave it over to questions. I went over a couple of minutes, I think.
I think you meant the TUE committee, which is the Telecommunications, Utilities, and Energy Committee.
That's correct. Thank you.
Yeah. So questions. Actually, I'm having some trouble with my view, so I may not be able to see people. But if you can raise your Zoom hand, ideally, to ask questions, I'll be able to see that.
I just want to point out that exporting means exporting to the grid. Just in case people don't understand that.
Yeah.
Could you
So,
put the contact information back up? Could you put the contact information back up just for a moment longer?
Yep. Let's see here.
Thank you.
Uh-huh.
so go ahead, Rick.
Thank you, Paul. That was a great presentation. Here's my question. Climate Chief Melissa Hoffer has said that she strongly supports municipal solar and community solar. Will the Healy administration support the Senate bill that you have described and the program that you have described? And if they're not yet on record for it, how do we mobilize them to do that?
It's a very good question. I don't know, Rick, what the answer to that question is. I mean, currently, the Healy administration strategy is to uh, build transmission lines through Maine up to connect to Hydro-Quebec facilities and to expand Hydro-Quebec capacity on dams against the will of native tribes on those lands. So they're forcing Hydro-Quebec expansion onto Native Americans. They're forcing transmission lines onto the state of Maine, which voted against the transmission lines. And otherwise, they have stripped local governments of their permitting authority over grid batteries and have referred that to the state board that handles large power plants. So they're preempting local municipal permitting authority, and they're forcing transmission and power facilities on neighboring states and countries. So I would say they currently have a very draconian sort of emergency type of policy that does not respect the wishes of local communities. And so but on the other hand, they're trying to make an effort to, well, make a sort of gesture of deference toward communities in certain ways. They're getting pushback, and I think they want to appear sensitive to the wishes of communities, even though they clearly are not sensitive to the wishes of communities. I think they're trying to get tough the way that the Republicans are getting tough, but on their team for the Green side to be just as tough as the Republicans are on for oil and coal. But it's really the similar kind of harm that ultimately occurs. So, what I've been trying to say is, people need to accept responsibility for this problem because it's the reason why they're getting draconian is that, like the state of New York, that the climate goals are not being met. It's becoming an emergency. And as it becomes an emergency, the state will become more coercive. And that's just going to happen. So my main message in Massachusetts is that the aggregations here have not taken responsibility. They have these programs for 25 years, and very few of them have developed local resources. Very few of them have implemented energy efficiency regimes or done anything innovative at their end. They're just buying certificates. They're claiming success, which is really, I would say, a fictional success. And it's just been too easy to be true. So I'm going out and saying, look, you have this power, you have the ability to develop these resources. The state is not stopping them from doing so. In fact, the state encourages municipalities to develop local resources with one hand. With the other hand, it prevents them from accessing the energy efficiency funds paid by their own ratepayers. So you have this kind of two-handed approach. And it's just one hand needs to obey the other hand. And in particular, I would say that the Department of Public Utilities needs to be brought to heel. Uh, it's not unique to that agency. Many state regulators have this codependent relationship with the utilities and develop a hostile attitude toward entities that aren't under their regulatory authority. And CCAs are not really under their regulatory authority. So you have this kind of culture paradigm war going on. And I think if the connection can be made between those two subjects, then I think the governor could be persuaded that this is a really good idea. You know what I mean? And that communities should be empowered, really be empowered to do these things and not be discouraged. And because frankly, I mean, the municipalities aren't doing anything, but they haven't been told to. I mean, if you look at the DOER's information or the DPU's information that is given out to aggregations, it just isn't very helpful, and it has never been very helpful. They've really encouraged communities to take the cookie cutter approach, um, and rather than to step out of out of the box and do some thinking and do some acting and use the powers that municipalities have, which are very significant, which you see in recycling programs, for example, and resiliency program effort. Towns can do things that the state itself cannot do, and to recognize that those powers should be used and encouraged.
Thank you. Dan.
Hi, thank you very much, Paul. This is very interesting work. I have a slightly more technical question. You're talking about building a DER, which is a microgrid spanning a neighborhood or whatever, and not using the existing grid. So does that mean that there would be new electrical cables running between houses in order to support this microgrid? I'm just having a little difficulty seeing how that works.
Yeah, Dan, I would say it's a little more nuanced than that. I mean, the microgrids are one category which can be brought into play in certain circumstances, and cannot be brought into play in other circumstances. There's where depending on the land ownership, depending on rights of way that pass between buildings, the control of those rights of way. So different factors come into play that limit how much a microgrid can be used to connect systems. So what we do in New York is just to take a case-by-case basis to look at a situation, and restrictions apply to microgrids that don't apply to thermal loops. and that don't apply to nanogrids, right? So they're depending on the barriers that are in play, between buildings in a location, we would either apply, we would first apply a nanogrid, then a thermal loop, then a microgrid, and then a mini uh, district. And so it kind of depends on what your, which buildings they are and whether they're on a campus environment or if they're, if they have rights of way passing between them. And then obviously depending on the franchise agreements, who owns and controls the rights of way, what are the terms of the use of the rights of way. So there's a lot of technical work has to be done to parse what you can do in any given situation. So we're not applying a sort of generic um, model of a microgrid just broadly. And generally, we're not intending to disconnect loads from the grid. Uh, that is at least certainly not de facto. Uh, we don't anticipate in most locations that you'd have sufficient resources to provide all the power and heat. You would need the grid. You just wouldn't need to export onto the grid. So the issue here is not whether to connect to it, but just whether you need to export. And that's really a financial issue, which is does a system depend upon payments, net metering payments, for it to have a positive return on investment, to be a viable investment for the owner and for the user. But we don't anticipate. So what we're generally saying is we it depends again on location, but a building, vehicles, heating systems, um, fuel cells can provide, depending on how many of these resources are brought into play, depending on how many people in those buildings are participating in those systems, will consent to participate, to use the systems, to own the systems. That all has to be done essentially on a building to building basis.
I see. So the condominium complex where my brother is currently living would be an example of a place that you could readily do this, readily do a microgrid, or a college campus. But a neighborhood would be more difficult.
Yeah.
Is there any scenario in which a neighborhood could have a microgrid if you take net metering out of the equation, so there's no expectation of payments? Is there a scenario under which a neighborhood could maybe by actually attaching to the grid but not expecting payments, still use the local grid? Or is that just not practical?
It's a very interesting question, Dan. It's again, I would say it's case by case, because it depends on so many factors. We just actually got hired by Ann Arbor a few years ago to figure something out, sort of like this, and it ended up. We found that, for example, this is a good example because they said we want to do CCA, and so just did a little review of the situation. Michigan realized this is not in the cards. They're not going to pass a law there. Um, and so over the years, I'd kind of learned about franchise agreements because municipalities have agreements, franchise agreements with utilities to use their rights of way to put in the poles and wires. And those agreements sometimes expire. And when they do expire, the cities have an opportunity to renegotiate the terms of that agreement. And so they can place conditions on the terms and they have leverage. Sometimes it's like every 10 years, every 20 years, these agreements expire. And it's a major event for a municipality because they can say, hey, we want to have, use of this, or we want to change that. We want to be able to use the right of way or string wires or things like that, right? But also, very interestingly, after World War II, many municipalities, particularly in California, where I worked for a long time, this is how I learned this, signed perpetual agreements with the utility. Forever, you will be the sole user of our right of way until the end of time. They signed these agreements with many municipalities, and which is fascinating that a government could give a right until the end of time to a private company, but they did. But some of them who did so under what they called non-exclusive terms. So I remember 25 years ago reading this and thinking, that means that in theory you could put another set of poles and wires on the same right of way and there's nothing the utility could do about it, right? So we started looking at franchise agreements of municipalities, and when they asked that question that you asked, we'd say, well, let's look at your franchise agreement, because if you have a non-exclusive or if you have an expiration coming up, then you can plan around that. You can say we're going to start using those rights away, uh, or you can just say we're going to use them tomorrow. So what we did with Ann Arbor was to say, why don't you just create a municipal utility, which is a behind the meter utility? And the other thing, they had to have a financing source. So we did some research on their revenue bonds. We posted this Ann Arbor's report on this on our website. If you want to download it, it's on there. Um, and they had a revenue bond authority, which a lot of municipalities have. They can issue bonds if they have revenues. If they're not going to raise taxes for it, if they have a source of revenue to pay the bonds, they can just issue bonds. So we said, well, if you install behind the meter utility and issue bonds, then you could just put solar on roofs and sell as a supplemental utility. So you're not taking out the utility, you're just competing directly against its meter on the building. And then over time, if you want to start connecting buildings with microgrids and nanogrids, you could just do it incrementally. So you put a system on the rooftop, you start serving that building, and if the people next door in the next building sign up and they want to have it on their rooftop, then you connect those two buildings, and then you kind of daisy chain from there and build out from there incrementally. So it isn't this gargantuan, huge investment, build a whole distribution grid, which is a big bite. No, you just string a wire across between the two buildings, and just build it out from there. That's what they did. They ended up doing that, and they formed a sustainable energy utility, which is not a CCA, and they're not doing supply. They're just doing this other thing. So a CCA could do that too. You could do a CCA, and you could do a sustainable energy utility, and you could use these municipal powers that are just kind of latent, sitting around from 1890s and 1910, when these systems were first created and authorized by law and under contracts and franchise agreements. And just if you review those franchise agreements and find that they expire or that they're non-exclusive, then you can do things. If they're exclusive and they won't expire for 20 years, then you're kind of screwed.
Thank you.
Wow. Thank you so much, Paul. That's really thinking out of the box. Martha.
Yes. Okay. Well, thank you. Well, I served on Amherst's solar bylaw working group for 2 years. Unfortunately, the solar bylaw then went and sat in the town council for a year, got nowhere. But aside from that, we studied Massachusetts climate plans and their goals for new renewable energy and so on. And then I listened to and actually testified to the state committee last year that was studying, whether the state should take over regulation of solar panels from the communities and so on, and really pushing for, more large solar panels and so on. And I have the strong impression from that Eastern Massachusetts really is looking to all this wonderful open land in Western Massachusetts to, pave it with solar and supply the energy for Boston and environs, which of course means, really building up the grid. It's the opposite of the local distribution and so on. But it's also the case, what developers were telling us, that at the present time, if they wanted to put up a modest solar array in Amherst, 5-10 acres or something, Eversource would be charging them $1 million a mile to put up the three-phase transmission line that was needed, because they would be required to have, battery storage so that you would spread the power output over the 24-hour day and so on. And so it's meant that it's been very discouraging for companies to try to do, say, a modest size array that would fit in our landscape better. A 5-acre array or something is, doesn't make sense financially because of this huge cost to, go with the transmission. Now, if you wanted to do a distributed, network like you're talking about, then would you really be using then literally separate wiring? Because, once you put the electrons on the grid, you can't really tell them where to go, right? Uh,
Yeah.
and the other thing is, though, a very separate point about an advantage of microgrids is being a person old enough to remember the great blackout of 1965 in New York, New York State. These days there's always risk of the large grid failure or hacking failure, and deliberate failures. And so a different question then would be whether you see microgrids with local control and literally separate wirings, that would be something that would be a defense against potential failures of the larger grid. So that's two separate questions, really. It's one is about, Eastern Massachusetts putting pressure on us to use all our quote wide open spaces to supply them with renewable solar power, versus, using it for local aggregation. And then about, a microgrid that could be separated from the grid as something that would be, useful long-term for our defense.
I think absolutely. On the first question, um, yeah, I mean it's such an old story here. I mean, you have the Quabbin Reservoir. You
Right?
have
Yeah.
Big Dig. They dumped all the waste from the Big Dig. What was that, Wendell, when they did that? Uh, the Big Dig dumped the waste in Wendell. It's kind of a long way to drive a lot of waste like uh, and the sacrifice area idea of an urban area, an immense urban area, immensely wealthy urban area, which also is rich in aggregations, right? So I mean, I look at it and think, I mean, Boston, all the cities in Metro Boston are aggregations, are CCAs. They're all. So you are, but so are they. These are municipal governments. They should be sort of collegial and collaborative and communicate with each other. But instead, it's just, you're going to be our sacrifice area, and we're not going to talk about it at all. In the meantime, the Mayor of Boston was a big supporter of the aggregation. She was the lead supporter of the CCA in Boston, and she called me actually a few years ago and asked me advice about it. And she seemed to want to do all these great things, but they never did anything. It's just like all the other aggregations in the state. They just never do anything. They talk about it and they never do anything. It kind of blows my. That's why we're working in New York, because it's just like nobody wants to do anything here. Everyone thinks they're doing just great with their certificates, and that I had tell them you're not. Your certificates are garbage, and it's really a shame, to have people that think that they're kind of leaders and virtuous that are not leading and they're not virtuous. Same goes with waste because we're working on waste. All the municipalities in the state are sending their garbage on trucks and their sewage. They're dumping the sewage in the Connecticut River. They're sending their garbage in trucks and trains to South Carolina and the Indian reservations in northern New York on the Canadian border. This is today. This is the standard practice in the state of Massachusetts. And you tell people, I've told this to 15 municipalities in this region, and every one of them just stare at me like this. They just stare at me and they do nothing. And there's just this kind of complacency. And so the metro area, so my point of view is that that's the issue and that it needs to be confronted. And so if communities out here are taking it in hand to do such a thing as you suggested, which is local facilities to innovate on the microgrid end, to enhance resilience, to prove out these systems, I think it would give us some moral authority to confront Boston and metro area cities to say, why aren't you doing these things? The problem is that we're not doing them here either. And so no one has moral authority in
Chris
this.
Johnson is on, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I feel that we're not really going to get a lot of progress until we can find a way to financially stimulate solar canopies over parking lots. Think of all the paved areas there are in cities and towns and so on that, you know, are just ripe for putting on, solar arrays, the double use, but it's
Yeah.
expensive. And until we have a way to finance it, nobody's willing to really,
24 people on this.
yeah.
It is.
Darcy, can you mute the speaker?
No, I totally agree. You fly over Boston, it kind of speaks for itself. How many solar panels do you see? Not
Yeah.
very many. And the truth is that solar panels are now basically selling at 20 cents a watt, right? It was 50 cents a watt 2 years ago. It was $5 a watt 10 years ago. It was $10 a watt 15 years ago. 20 cents a watt. Solar power is insanely inexpensive, incredibly inexpensive. The expense of the systems primarily at this point, 70% of the costs of the systems that you buy are marketing costs. 70. In California, it used to be considered an outrage that 50% of the cost was marketing cost. Now it's 70% of the cost. The actual equipment costs nothing. And so the real issue is, can you bypass all the marketing costs? Aggregations are designed specifically to bypass marketing costs. That's the whole idea of aggregation. Don't use marketing to sell energy. Just aggregate. You don't need to market if you aggregate. That's the whole point. And so if you aggregate solar, you don't have a marketing cost to solar. And so there goes 70% of the cost of solar. In theory, if you can set it up properly, your cost is dramatically reduced. It's just that everyone's working through these market structures. Everyone's net metering. It's all cookie cutter. And so when they say they give you a price for how expensive it isn't based on the equipment. It's based upon the marketing costs. It's based upon the net metering payments. It's based upon the renewable energy certificate allocations. It's all these other costs. It's the integration costs. It's not really the equipment. So my view is just the aggregations, because they haven't changed their views around their mission and their capacities, and largely because I think they're intellectually captive to their brokers, and their brokers uh, do not want to do these things, and so they advise them not to do them. And it holds them in this sort of paralysis, where they just think you can't do these things. It's too hard. It's too complicated. All these questions we don't, and so they just never do it. And it's in a kind of inertia. But I think, I don't know, did I lose? Oh, Martha, there you are. You just moved to my screen. There you are. But I think you're absolutely right in terms of the resilience potential of microgrids. And that can apply to a microgrid that disconnects physically from the grid, as you say. You can place, then this depends very much on the details of a situation. Like I said, in terms of the franchise agreement, in terms of the utility. But there are microgrids, many that have the capacity to automatically connect and disconnect to island from the grid. And to do it seamlessly, in whatever it is, like zero point 0.3 nanosecond switching that's faster than 60 hertz, so that the computers don't reboot, nothing stops. They can't even tell that it's disconnected and reconnected. And this is now standard equipment. It's not fancy. I mean, some of the switches can be expensive, but those are for big systems that are multi-million dollar systems. If you have a microgrid that big, it's a multi-million dollar system. And the switching is not that expensive compared to the whole cost of the system. Smaller systems like nanogrids and thermal loops, these are just, small circuits that are behind the grid. They don't have to coordinate with the utility on ground fault controls and things like that, engineering controls. So they're much easier to install without the utility providing technical assistance on the grid side for ground fault protection. And so
Well,
there are cheap small versions and expensive big versions of what you're describing, I guess is what I'm saying.
Paul, I'd like to give other people a chance to ask their questions. So, Kent.
Yeah, hi. I have just a fundamental question, which is if you don't have net metering and you don't have a way of getting income that way, and I haven't heard you speak about any other kind of market mechanism sort of within a DER network. Are we talking about bill reduction? Is that from an economic point of view, is that the advantage of doing what you're talking about, the vision that you have?
Yes, Kent. It's basically the idea is to switch from a a net metering or sale or receipt of subsidy approach, which I would call like a virtual sale, where you seem to be selling your energy back to the grid, um, to an avoided cost approach. And that's why it's so important to be able to, and what we're doing in Ithaca, for example, is we're not offering solar to people. Solar is not a product, and even solar in a battery is not a product. The product is solar and a heating system replacement and a vehicle replacement. And so the systems use the heating system and the vehicle as storage. Then we target locations where there are multiple users that want to share those facilities. So there's both integration, interoperability as storage, and physical on-site sharing. And in other words, to maximize self-consumption on the site and to drive that up to the point where the avoided cost is a sufficient payback on the system. So it does cause a lot of integration complexity, basically. It requires a lot of engagement and a lot of, data collection, analysis, and site selection. And it's heavy on the engineering side, basically. And so we're setting up a structure where we do the kind of macro level engineering without any fee and then solicit participation based upon that analysis. So we do like bucket collection of the data. We sift the data, analyze every building. We start to get a drip feed of subscribers that want in, and we start to select groups based on their locations, and then identify projects based upon where those things intersect, and then define solicitations, sign the contracts, arrange the financing, and solicit to developers. So it's sort of a reverse engineering kind of an approach to how you select a site and how one signs up and how technology is selected, as opposed to the current approach, which says, who wants solar? Sign up here. And sort of where you're choosing the technology first, and then you're choosing the customer because they want it. So instead, it's based on where are you, who are you, what do you do, how long is your commute, how well can you fit into a shared structure, and how can we target it and try to build it out from a location, and how can we get people with different complementary energy usage patterns to cooperate. So it's complex on the logistical side in order to make it not necessary to net meter.
So it sounds like you're not talking about individual homeowners then. You're talking about building multi-family dwellings or perhaps municipal buildings. So we've got a microgrid project, for example, in Chelsea that involves the city of Chelsea and its municipal buildings. How does what you're talking about relate to that and to individual homeowners or something in between?
Well, we're trying to sort of open it up on both ends. So if someone wants to participate in a system, they can do it. They can participate um, uh, in their own building if they have site control. So if you are alone in a residence, if the conditions permit, then we could do it, right? But it does depend on conditions because we don't want to export. And so people that work at home, for example, those sorts of homeowners or who are retired, who are at home during the day. The challenge is with someone who commutes because people who commute are leaving the building, coming and going. And net metering is really designed for people who are coming and going, right? The energy is generating when they're not at home. So um, in the case of those who are single-family homes, but who have a sufficient on-site consumption to fit some kind of DER system, uh, or whose commute is short enough that the vehicle would have enough battery capacity when they got home that it would pay for itself. That's the whole issue, is like, is there an economic way to do this based on a site? If there isn't, then we open up community solar on municipal facilities. We also open up electric vehicles that are on nearby facilities, so participation can be flexible and only involve a vehicle. But it's meant to be, the ownership structures are meant to be multi-party, multi-stakeholder, cooperative-based agreements, where some people can be, owning or using the whole system every day. Other people can just be using the cars. Other people might just be using a heating system. So it kind of depends on the situation. But it's meant to be flexible. And then the municipalities' facilities will be shared out up to 49% in shares for people that just can't find any other means of participation. So it's trying to find something for everybody, but not the same thing for everybody, because it is very essentially situational.
And this is in New York right now, or are you talking about Massachusetts, or both?
It's just in New York. We're piloting it in New York. We got approved by the New York Public Service Commission to do so in December, and we've been under contract with the city and town of Ithaca for a few years, and they've already adopted their local laws and their DER plans, and they've consented to these procedures I'm describing to you, and to provide this adequate support for us to be able to implement the program. And we're underway there, but not in Massachusetts, because we just didn't find anyone with the appetite here. Really.
Well, maybe you should, let us help you find people with the appetite here, because I certainly would.
Absolutely. We'd love to do it. We're kind of watching in frustration, because there's a lot of communities that have 100% renewable certificates, class 1 certificates. They're trying to do all sorts of innovative things, but their CCA programs are just this other thing.
Yeah.
So it's tricky to cut in sort of diagonally into existing CCAs, because the decision makers tend to depend utterly on their brokers for advice.
Mhm.
And it's hard to separate someone from their broker.
Let's hear
Thank you
from
very much.
let's hear from Roy.
Great, thanks, and thanks for the very stimulating presentation. My question is on S.2301 and the notion of the non-export tariff. If I understand, this would allow a municipality or a municipal aggregation to import from, but not export to the greater grid. And if that's the case, doesn't that limitation hurt the profitability of the microgrid, of the DERs in the microgrid? If you have a lot of solar, on a sunny, mild day, you're going to have more energy than you can use. You'd want to export that. So isn't that a problem? Or are you thinking that you could also apply for an export tariff in parallel with the non-export tariff? And then when the export tariff comes through, it might be a few years, then you could get more value out of your DERs?
Certainly, Roy. Yeah, I mean, I believe me, I get the appeal of receiving those payments to as far as the economics and return on investment. Receiving a subsidy is more attractive than not receiving a subsidy, right? Just that's generally true. The problem is the subsidy is capped and is political. So, like I said, California has not only canceled the tariff, but they are reversing the tariff. They are stripping the contracts. So, which means that all those systems, all those financial agreements, all the loan agreements for how many million systems are compromised. So they're not secure, which means that bankers, lenders are not going to make loans on those. Okay. If the state can reverse the contract that provides revenue on the financing of an agreement, then that entire category of contract is invalidated from a banking perspective. So it's just, this is happening already, and it's happening at 10% cap, 15% cap. In Germany, where they had a true feed-in tariff and had a powerful political mandate from the federal government to the local government, all levels, they have done the same thing when they reach 25%. So you cannot reach 100% on a subsidy. You just can't. Because a subsidy like welfare, you have to have people that are middle class and earning income to pay the subsidy to people on welfare. If everyone is unemployed, there is no welfare.
Hmm.
And this is the same problem with net metering. So we're looking at it from a system perspective of for a community like Ithaca that has the policy mandate saying they want to have community-wide decarbonization of all buildings, that net metering simply cannot provide that pathway, and it never will provide that pathway. So it's not that we don't like to receive a subsidy, but it's that we want to find the pathway that does not depend upon the subsidy, so that a community-wide decarbonization is possible. And so, but it does introduce this complexity of what do you do with extra capacity, and that's where all the importance of targeting comes in, right? Which is that we will be filtering the design of these systems based upon the um, the behavioral pattern of each consumer. And so that's where questions like, do you commute to work? How many miles do you commute to work? What hours are you at home? Like it becomes germane. When are you at home? And if you're never at home, you really should not have solar on your roof. And how many second homes have subsidized solar on the roof in Massachusetts? It's actually an outrage. It's an outrage because other ratepayers paid for that. They're empty houses of the rich being paid for by the poor. This is how you get a reversal of the policy because it is unjust. It is unjust. And so that's the issue is that we set up these policies that do not have end games. They have brick walls at the end of the road. And they not only stop, but they discredit the technology. They cause backlash. Greenlash, they're now calling it in the media, greenlash. And it's like all of a sudden now you're a bad guy if you have an electric car. People are going to key your car because you received a subsidy. You're an elite welfare recipient or whatever. And it's crazy. It's very dangerous in my view. And so I look at it and think, okay, yes, that we will not, if we don't receive the subsidy, a consumer could say, just give me the subsidy. I'm not interested in your utopian idea. I just want the payment, please. But we're doing this community-wide thing. It's not really a product. And so we're just looking at it kind of from the other end of the telescope, which is, can we design these systems so they don't need subsidies? And we believe yes. And the main reasons are that avoided cost, if you integrate vehicles and heating systems and waste systems, waste is a weird outlier, but it's very important because of carbon, because they're huge emitters, um, methane emitters, and they're an energy resource, hydrogen resource. So I haven't talked about that because it's kind of the wildest part of the program. But if you just look at heating and vehicles and electric and you combine them, then you have not one avoided cost price point, but three. You're not just avoiding the price of electricity, you're avoiding the price of natural gas and gasoline. Uh, those gasoline has a very high price point. So avoided cost of gasoline has a high value, a higher value than avoided cost of electricity. So to the extent that and heating, it varies by state, whether natural gas BTUs versus kilowatts hours, the relative cost avoidance. But in terms of overall volatility, there's significant benefits to avoiding therms of natural gas BTUs. So our belief is that to the extent that you combine avoided cost through integration, interoperability, that you integrate energy efficiency measures. That's why the energy efficiency funding is important. That you build energy efficiency measures into these systems before they're designed. And in other words, that you size the renewable energy systems to a retrofitted environment, not to an unretrofitted environment. And then that you facilitate sharing and cooperation between people. These all essentially enhance the self-consumption return on investment. To the extent that you have no integration and no sharing, no interoperability, isolated renewable energy assets, just a solar panel or a solar panel plus a wall battery, which is incredibly expensive compared to an electric vehicle with a bidirectional charger. Uh, Again, that vehicle with the bidirectional charger is pretty important in the economics, I would say. And that's just coming on the market. You have three-phase bidirectional chargers are now widespread. The single phase are entering the market now. They exist. They have UL approval, and they're entering the market. But once they come into play, and they are coming into play, then your 40 kilowatt, your 70 kilowatt car, you've got 4 to 7 Tesla batteries in your driveway. And so again, it comes down to how long is your commute, how many people use that car. There has to be some behavioral cooperation involved in this to make it work. It isn't just the transcendent 24/7, don't even think about it power that we've been conditioned to expect. It's much more involved. And admittedly, it's just there is logistical complexity to this model. But if it is, we believe, again, we're just preparing to implement this, but we believe, for the same reason that we believe that green bonds would make renewable energy cheaper, we believe this will make renewable energy cheaper. And green bonds made renewable energy a lot cheaper. Having long-term investments and 20-year contracts and not 2-year contracts makes renewable energy a lot cheaper.
So Paul, let's move on now to the next question.
Okay, all right.
Al. Al, you need to unmute.
Yes, hi. My name is Al Blake, and I live in Beckett in the Berkshires.
Oh.
And as you're probably aware, most of the Berkshires and Franklin County use colonial power for aggregation, and it's certainly, as you're pointing out, is not the most efficient thing to do. And they actually say that we could do some of the things that you could do, but most of the towns in the Berkshires and Franklin County are run by volunteers. And I'm on the planning board and the energy committee, and we certainly don't have the resources to try to even attempt what you're suggesting, even though I think it's a great idea. So I was just curious if you think there would be an entity like Colonial Power or yours that could look at either Franklin County or Berkshire County, because I think it's ripe for a test or a pilot project to try to do something in the vein that you're discussing, but it would need some entity to do that because we can't do it on our own. So that's my question.
Well, Al, if we had in Ithaca, we did Ithaca. We're not a big company, and we're not looking really to get big. We're interested in developing the model, and so um, um, we went with Ithaca because they wanted to do this, and we don't have to persuade them to do it. Um, so it really comes down to if you have to persuade the decision makers, all these layers of thinking are too much. It's just too much.
Yep.
So in Ithaca, they know they have a local Green New Deal. They have a community-wide decarbonization target, 2030. Like they've adopted everything. So for them, it's just how. It's not whether to do, it's how to do. And so they were ready. And so we can work with them because it's just a matter of how. I don't have to be their advocate there and persuading them, which is what you're having to do now here, to persuade them that these are important things that they should decide to do. Um, and that's really the trick. If we find anyone that wants to do it, we'll do it. But they have to want it. We're not going to go there and tell them they should do it. We'll just tell them
You,
how they can do it and what they need to do if they want that to happen. And if they're in that state of mind, then we can do it. And the conversation is constructive. And like we had to get, because it really comes down to just that. It just comes down to, can your select board members or city council members, do they get it? And do they trust staff or volunteers to make these judgments and is there an open channel to discuss what the town can do to support the program? What abilities does it have? Like the town of Ithaca is pretty small, and there wasn't a lot they could do. They only have a few municipal buildings and not that many staff. But we had the city and the town together. We combined them. It was big enough that it was worth doing. Um, and so we don't need that much from them, but we do need them to provide the support that they can provide. And if they're not ready, if they're not willing to do that, that's really the question is, are they willing to do it? Um, and which are things like, will you include, could we get all the data on your municipal buildings? And we'd like to get all the data on your fleet purchases. And when do you buy trucks? And, we want the town to put skin in it.
Yeah.
And so that you're going to participate. If we're gonna tell everyone in the community to participate, well, what about is the town going to participate? And to have them go through that, like, oh, well, you want us to do that too, and we had to just go through all those things, and then we want to use your town newsletter and your robocaller and all those kinds of resources. We can't be paying marketing. We're trying to bypass marketing cost. That's the whole point. So we need the town to be the handshake, to be the face, the relationship, and to have this be authentic and not just a product of some outsourced company that no one knows about. These are ineffective ways to do things. And so to have the town be effective and present and sort of own what's happening is the essential layer. If they just want to have it be fobbed off to someone, then forget it.
I'd like to move on to another question, see if we can get through before we run out of time.
Great.
Lydia?
Oh, you're muted,
Yeah,
Lydia.
sorry. Yeah. Well, I just kind of wanted to go back to the bill and, well, you said a lot of bad things about the CCAs in Massachusetts,
Ah,
that they're not connected to each other, that they're not communicating with each other. Is there another activist organization in Massachusetts that's trying to connect them, is trying to do any of this? Or is it the people in this room today that are kind of hearing your sermon about this? Are you available to do the same presentation in other places if there's an activist group that really wants to move on a bigger scale than just the people here?
of course. I mean, yeah, I've been pretty active up in Franklin. That was where this all happened. Was Al Norman and Anna Georgie, the Wendell people, and some Greenfield people, and some Coleraine people that wanted to do this. And it was partly because of the battery project there. Um, I think activated them, realizing they were going to get a huge grid battery in the middle of a wetland and that they didn't need, and just had no idea why it is that would be in their town, not realizing that there was a transmission line going through their town. So it kind of raised there. Plus, Anna Georgie was an anti-nuclear activist from the early set. She was one of the 4 or 5 people that started the anti-nuclear movement. So she's got this a lot of energy and experience doing political organizing, and she's got a group in Wendell. Al Norman is very active, stopping the Walmart there in Greenfield years ago, and he's done that, and he's involved in a lot of legislation. He's got a lot of ability in the legislature, moving bills. So that's kind of what I've had going, really, is that those people. We've been giving presentations, whether on the waste side of the discussion or on the energy side, quite a few of these. So I definitely give them and will give them anytime anybody is interested in doing it. I was just trying to give like the threshold criteria for like what it really takes to do 3.0, just because 1.0 is so outsourced, it's so de minimis, like people don't have to do anything. And it's just push a button, you get 1.0. But the problem is that it never goes beyond that. And 2.0 was this big lift where we had to create a huge government agency, a joint powers agency. And I know you tried to set that up, and then the towns backed out of it. But we also had to set up, this is a wholesale model where they had to put up, like San Francisco, I worked for over 10 years, 15 years in San Francisco, getting that aggregation going. We had to give the mayor, Gavin Newsom, he had to put $25 million into an escrow account to launch that program, putting city general funds at risk to launch that program. So those programs were very heavy to launch, politically very heavy to launch. 3.0 is not heavy to launch, but if it can't just be, it's designed for 1.0 environment, to answer Al's question, where there aren't any resources. It's really meant to be a low resource model. That's why it's so focused on engaging people, not engaging, like creating a big agency and doing all big projects, grid projects, centralized large, like what they're doing in California, these really huge solar projects, huge geothermal wind projects, but instead to engage users and to have them be the owner and to have them be the participant, to sort of redirect the focus of the service on having the users make all these decisions and do all these things. So it's less government centered. We kind of went from the 1.0 is centered on the supplier, 2.0 is centered on the government, 3.0 is centered on the user. But to get to the user, I can't go around, shaking hands and converting people and selling them solar panels. We're not a sales company. And so we can take the data, we can provide the messaging, we can play the role of the technical role, but we need the municipality to be the one that is intermediary, that they have to actively support it with communication, but also with their accounts, their energy accounts, their buildings, their fleets. And so if they don't want to do it, then that's the litmus test. It's like, oh no, not us, just the community. It's like, okay, forget it, because it just means they don't mean it, and it just won't work if they don't mean it.
Thank you.
Thank you. And Regine.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks so much, Paul, for that talk and for the conversation. It's been very inspiring. For 3.0, I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about the policy side or the legislative side and connect that back to the proposed legislation here in Massachusetts. So I'm new to learning all about this, but it's my understanding that one of the problems now, and I'm not sure how central this problem is for what you're doing in New York, is that utilities are the only ones who are allowed to distribute and sell electricity across property boundaries. So that's really stymied the possibility for any type of basically microgrid or DER expansion. So I guess the first question is that a problem in New York State, or do they have a different policy landscape around that, or how are you getting around that? And second of all, for the Massachusetts side, again, how would this bill, if at all, address that? And is it needed to be addressed? That was a lot of questions. So, and you could take any subset of them.
No, it's a good question, Regina. It's a very complex environment, and the ability. That's where there's this sort of pecking order of or taxonomy of different systems, right? Depending on that legal barrier that can exist in many places. If you have a microgrid that is crossing property lines, um, you have a problem under those circumstances. If you have a nanogrid inside of a multi-residential building or in a campus environment, then you don't have that problem. If you have electric vehicles that are being shared between residents of adjacent buildings whose buildings cannot be connected across property lines, then you bypass that problem. And if you have a thermal loop, the thermal loops are not subject to the same restriction. And so in some ways, the heating and vehicles are really the connective tissues that bypass utility control across property lines, because you can convert power into heat. And so to the extent that you have power generation on one building, you can distribute heat to adjacent buildings. And you can't distribute power across to adjacent buildings, but you can share your electric vehicles with those adjacent buildings. And if you like, you could move the electric vehicle over to that building and connect it to its bidirectional charger. And so there are bypass opportunities that exist, but they do depend upon lots of integration and lots of targeting, and they require some participation and interest by the people in those
So
systems.
the proposition, the fundamental underlying proposition is that, again, I don't know if it's the case in New York, but certainly here in Massachusetts, it is not possible to break the utility stranglehold on that rule that seems to be in Massachusetts law, basically.
I haven't examined the Massachusetts law. I wouldn't contest it because it's sort of typical. I mean, you have in California, you have Rule 21. Rule 21 is we kind of developed in that environment, and Rule 21 has similar restrictions for crossing public rights of way.
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't prohibit crossing property lines, but it prohibits crossing rights of way. And so, yeah, there's the only the other the nuclear angle that I mentioned earlier on in terms of the the right of a utility to use rights of way for its poles and wires. It's right to, because there's a statutory authority under state law, but then there are the franchise authorities under local law. And so to the extent that if I were to do the legal analysis, I would look at the state law, and that I would look at the municipal franchise agreement and determine whether or not there is a right, a non-exclusive right within the franchise agreement. And if there is a non-exclusive right, then it's my understanding that that would prevail, and that because the municipality would have a de facto right effectively to put in parallel poles and wires. And no statute, in my opinion, could really undermine that right under home rule. But if there weren't any such provision in the franchise agreement, if there was an expiration date, then you can negotiate around the expiration date. I did this City of Boulder. They had a program in 2010 where we were hired to negotiate with Excel on their franchise renewal, and we did it, and it led to a municipalization effort, which since is unwound in court, and the city council's backed out. But they did it for about 10 years because they had an expiring agreement. And so when it was expiring, the city said, okay, it's going to expire. We're out unless you will make all these concessions around things like this. We want to connect facilities. We want to cross property, and we want you to concede these rights. So you have leverage around renewals, and you have leverage around exclusivity. Then there would be statutes that can apply to it. Then there's the threat. There's municipalization threat is another option, and there is something called spot municipalization, which is another very interesting option in my view. And that's where you condemn like one line, like a block. We're going to condemn one line down that block, just that right there. And you can legally condemn a single stretch of power line in the middle of your city. And this introduces these sort of nonlinear factors where you can scare the utility into making concessions because you do have power, but it just depends upon the city council's uh, willingness to engage in a battle with the utility. So in my view, it's very gray area, and there's no like absolute prohibition that the lawyers will always sort of present it as, no, we have this absolute, it's like nothing is absolute. It really comes down to how how much fight do you have in the city council, and the mayor is the most important, actually, the mayor. If the mayor is not on board, they'll cut you off at the knees. And usually that's what they do. They have the mayor in their pocket, and the city council wants to do it, but the mayor won't do it. And that happens. But if you happen to have a good mayor and a strong council, and they want to do it, and they want to play hardball, then there's all these different things they can do.
So Paul, we are out of time. I can see that we could go on for a whole nother hour and a half with you, and perhaps we will have you back to
Thank you.
continue and go into more details.
Thank you.
But I want to thank you very much. You've really piqued our interest and gotten our creative juices going. And
Thank you, Andrea. Thank you. It's a pleasure. I'm really glad
great.
to be here. Glad to meet you all and see you again. It's been
And thank you, everybody, for attending and asking great questions. It's been a really good evening.